the area of land use interaction, especially with the climate system, looking at climate variability in the short term, but also at climate scenarios. He has a lot of experience now, many years of experience in the development of climate services. So Ronald is really the person that can tell you, that can go all the way through the process of developing climate services. He's teaching students at the University of Wageningen, and finally, and most importantly for us today, probably, is deeply engaged now with the training activities which are provided by the Copernicus Climate Change Service. So I would like to really thank a lot Ronald for his availability, for contributing to this Living Lab today. And in leaving the floor to Ronald for his talk, I would invite everyone who has questions for Ronald to just leave a message in writing in the chat. I will look at it, take note, and we will have time for questions after Ronald's contribution, or if there is anything really important, I will be a filter for Ronald for questions and comments. So please, Ronald, the floor is yours, and thank you very much really for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Sandro. Thank you for this very kind introduction. Can everybody see my screen? There should be a red screen, more or less, with saying indicators for global agriculture showcases.
I think everyone can see, yes. Thank you.
Okay, then I will just work from that. Okay, so what I will talk about today is based on the experiences we gained in developing climate services within the Copernicus system, where we in a number of projects specifically developed a couple of indicators that are relevant for agriculture. And basically, we try in dealing with these services, we try to develop them from two, let's say, skill perspectives. One is really the local scale, at a local scale, or up to, let's say, the national scales, where we see a lot of variations in agricultural productivity from one year to the next. Changes in crop yields can easily be 10, 20, sometimes even 30% from one year to the next, especially in tropical countries. But of course, at the same time, at a global scale, a crop failure or a decrease in crop production in one region can easily be compensated by crop productivity in another region, which has a more favorable season. So from that point of view, we from the start thought it very important that it should have the service that we develop should have enough detail at the local level to be relevant, let's say, for farmers, or if not individual farmers, at least cooperatives or extension services, while at the same time it is relevant at the global scale for, let's say, policy making, or for food aid organizations, or for commodity traders, etc., who take this large scale perspective. So within the project where the most recent project where we developed these services, which made it to the, let's say, more operational level, we worked together with a couple of what we called user champions. One from, let's say, Agri Policy. In this case, it was GRC in Italy, of course, working very much for European Commission. The second one was, let's say, Agri Research, so agronomist, in this case represented by CGIR Institute, CIMMYT, which is responsible for wheat and maize breeding, especially in tropical countries. And the third party that we collaborated was really an agribusiness, in this case, a global operating agricultural information provider, information broker, I should say, grow intelligence. It was immediately clear from the beginning that they are very different, they have quite different perspectives of what is needed from a data service. When we look, for example, at the agri research, these are generally not climate specialists with a very minimal background, let's say meteorology. So their main request for having a good data service was ease of use. And the main use they wanted to make, well, that may be specific to this case, is that they were looking for proxies for missing observations. So their main request from the data that was continuous in space and continuous in time with no gaps. When we look for the other end at agribusiness, then very much important was timeliness of data. They're always looking very much for data that are as up to date as possible, preferably based on status monitoring of yesterday. So they can make an assessment of what let's say the outlook for crop productivity or around the world is, and take trading positions and things like that. Also, resolution in that case is very important, but they don't care about the interface because they have their own very beautiful, I must say, web interface. So all they required was an API, so they could contact the data service directly. Finally, when in this case we looked at GRC for their request for the data service was very much on continuity. They hoped that whatever we would provide was in the first place, of course, thoroughly quality assessed, but it also that it would be around for many years to come, because there's a whole downstream model chain built on the data service that we provide. That is not easy to adapt, and as a result, continuity, a long-term continuity from a service perspective was crucial for them. What we developed in the end was a couple of data sets based on let's say different time horizons, different applications, and different let's say granularity of the data that can be provided. So one was let's say climate forcing data of crop models. That's really for the agricultural research sector, the agronomists. Preferably for all time scales, downscaled, bias corrected, and if possible already in a format that is suitable for the various models that are around in this world. The second group, which I will talk a little bit less about today, is water-based indicators, because they are of course also similar to other already developed indicators in this case. And the third group that we talk about is agroclimatic indicators. So that's very much going into also into the future. And then we look at aggregated statistics like growing degree days or biologically effective degree days. Things like you might know the Hoekling index or heat or cold stress days, all these kind of things. And then the final data group that we developed was really combining Earth observation data, satellite-based data, together with climate data, that we could turn the combination into a almost near real-time assessment of dry matter productivity, but then crop-specific and focusing on, of course, the part that we use from crops, which generally are the seeds and not the total biomass. All these data sets we provide also with tools to aggregate them to, let's say, the respective cropping calendars around the world. So we, for the major crops, we added cropping calendars and, of course, also growing mass from where these crops currently can be found, while still allowing, of course, also to assess the same things for different regions in light of changes that might occur, which is the most favorable place for certain crops to grow. So what I will try to do, I will go each of these data groups briefly and show you what is their, let's say, can be their use and how they have been developed and what can be found in them. So let's start with the climate enhanced satellite data, where I take as a kind of showcase, let's say, the soybean industry in the United States. So here the need very much was for people like commodity traders or food or feed processing industry, as soybean is of course not only used for food but also for feed for animals a lot. And then, well, in this case a little bit less also for food security purposes. And what is really needed is crop status information. And as I said already before, not just the total biomass, but also the edible parts, which generally are only the seeds. That's what is more relevant than the total biomass in general. So what do we do? There are various productivity data already around. Also in the Copernicus GLS, the global land system. However, that was a very generic kind of dry matter productivity, basically representing forests around the world. So we enhance that by using crop-specific light use efficiencies, crop-specific development indicators based on these growing degree days to use to allocate the DMP, for example, to seeds and to other parts of the plant, so that in the end we can provide not only total biomass, but especially the biomass in the storage organs or the much sought after, I would say, harvest index. Complicated diagram. The only thing I want to show is basically that we built from Copernicus data on the left. The red boxes on the left are existing Copernicus data products, and we move to the products on the right, which are the new ones that we developed for this global agriculture one, which is the bottom, the TWSO, the total weight of the storage organs, which is generally the most relevant parameter here for many users, because it really is the yield in terms of the edible parts. Then the in-between are some very simple aggregation and parameterizations, the blue boxes, and what makes it crop specific are a couple of parameters in the green boxes that we, in first instance, developed for the 4 main staple crops being soybean, maize, wheat, and rice. And that can easily be expanded also to other crops when such data are available. So in this case, we focus on soybean, which is of course used both for proteins, especially in the warmer climate where the higher protein levels are generally achieved, while the oil part of the soybean is generally grown in the more colder climates and is much used for both food, but also, for example, important for biofuels. And of course, the soybean meals and the residuals are very much used as feed in the cattle and the pig industry, for example. So we work together with Grow Intelligence, which provided these data to stock traders, to farmers, to soybean processing industries around the world, and had their own interface. And the type of question that the industry generally wants to know, which is said as much as possible up to date, is where are things growing presently? When can we expect the harvest to be ready? And how much can we expect? And how much should we, for example, organize the logistics around this? So one product that we have is the development stage, which tells us at what moment in time we can expect the crop to be ready for harvest. And here you see an example for the soybean mask on the United States, where the darker colors indicate that the crop is ready to harvest, and the light yellow colors indicate that it is not yet ready to be harvested. And the other product then comes really about crop yield. So you have the map, but of course you can zoom in on any particular location, and you can in principle also compare the current year with previous year. So we can see whether we can expect more or less yields than average, for example. We don't claim that the absolute values of this yield product are very precise, but the relative, the interannual dynamic should be quite okay. So the comparison between the current year and previous years, I think, can contain very valuable information for this type of industry. At the farmer level, many people, of course, are very much interested how much water is being used in growing the same crop. So we also have a combination of satellite data together with climate data that can produce a rather precise evaporation data. And evaporation data, of course, tells you how much water is lost and how much water you have to put in terms of irrigation or elsewhere to compensate for that. Same kind of thing, a couple of existing inputs on the left from the Copernicus system, in the end resulting in potential evapotranspiration and actual evapotranspiration on the far right. And in this case, this is not crop specific. So a similar kind of map and similar kind of use. We again, the absolute values are maybe not that very precise, but you think again the interannual dynamics are very relevant, and we can easily see whether in a specific region or a specific moment in time crops are or have been using more water than previous years or less water than previously is. Of course, also in the end will affect things like crop productivity. Just a couple of examples on actual and in the previous one, potential evapotranspiration. So this kind of product, we think, especially the near real-time product that we are is also getting online with a delay of only a couple of days, can be very relevant for, well, in this case, for example, this soybean plant and farm logistics. The second kind of product was the high granularity climate data or weather data for, let's say, agronomists. We think the basic ERA 5 product, which is is not directly useful for many people not familiar with the details of these data sets. So what we did, we provided them with a downscaling to go to even higher resolution. We did some agriculture-specific corrections there, bias correction, and we aggregated to a daily time scale, which still most crop models depend on, and then also adjusted for local time around the world. Well, some examples of products that are in there. In this case, we work together with CGIR. I already told you, especially with the CIMMYT, the institute responsible for breeding programs, mostly of wheat and maize. And you have to realize that CGIR is very important in providing seeds around the world, especially in tropical countries and less developed countries, that of course have to be adapted to local climates. So they work with so-called wheat yield trials, experimental wheat growing plots around the world, in many places around the world. And in the background of these few slides, you saw some examples of that. But in many of these areas, if there is any met station at all, these generally are very incomplete in terms of data coverage. So they're very much looking for complete, continuous, and as local as possible weather data to analyze the yield trials later on against. This is just an example which I cannot explain you the details, where we did or they did a principal component analysis between climate factors and different crop varieties grown in different areas around the world. And then you have things that in this case they focus, for example, on terminal environmental or terminal meteorological effects, the meteorology in the last part of the growing season, where in this case the temperature and radiation in the last part of the growing cycle was very important in determining the overall yield for specific varieties of, in this case, wheat. But the same, that's not the only purpose they intend to use it for. Another big interest is pests in wheat and maize around the world. Things like wheat blast or wheat rust. So they're also trying to develop early warning systems, again based mostly on meteorological input. So also there, the Copernicus came in as a very welcome data service. Finally. The last one I will discuss is indicators based on CMIP5 projections. So now we're talking very much about the far future, or well, the future of the coming few decades, where we used again, we took away some of the let's say the nasty processing steps which are not familiar for many agricultural users. So things like bias correction was already done on these data sets. There was already a selection made of representative climate models, a selection made of representative concentration pathways, so alternative futures. And we aggregated many of the data already to 10-day intervals, things like growing degree days or consecutive dry days, or all these kind of parameters, to a decadal 10-day interval, seasonal interval, or annual resolution for easy evaluation into the future. And again, also here we have an online app in the Copernicus system that combines it with crop maps and calendars to ease the type of evaluation you can do. In my own university, we then already using these data, we did a very nice, I think, kind of consultancy job for, in this case, Heineken, where we focused on future outlook for growing barley, in this case, for the malting industry. And we made an assessment of which areas around the world we could expect changes, significant changes in spring or winter barley, and not only in average yield, but also in variability, in volatility from one year to the next, which is it served as a very first global assessment, which will be followed on by focusing on the hotspots of change, using more detailed crop models later on. So what is the current status? The last one is already online for all users within the Copernicus system. So that is the top one here that you can see, which is set available on CDS already, whereas the crop productivity and evaporation indicators are presently only on the development support yet, but hopefully will become available in the next few months, also in a very up-to-date format, basically back to a couple of days ago. And the Ag Era 5, the agrometeorological indicators, are also very close to publication on the open portal of Copernicus already. That's where I end. I hope I gave you a kind of interview and I raised your interest in the use of these kind of data for various purposes. And I'm open for, of course, any further questions.
Thank you, Ronald. Thank you very much. Very interesting overview of the possibilities, potentials of using data to create information. I'm waiting for questions and comments, but meanwhile, I also do have a question for you, Ronald, and which is about the bias correction that you were mentioning when describing the preparation of the Ag Era 5 data set.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I would like to ask you to comment a bit more on what was exactly the procedure and the scope of bias correction in that context. And I'm asking this because we normally have described bias correction as a process that would be required, for example, for climate projections at different timescales to reproduce a bit the observed statistics in the data that then people use for their models. And we normally think that, for example, ERA 5 will be a reference data to process the bias correction. So, you know, to have clear out a bit of ambiguity in this, in using the same term for different things. Can you expand a bit on what is the bias correction which is applied to produce AG ERA 5?
Yeah. What I can say, AG ERA 5 or ERA 5, the only variable that is bias corrected here is precipitation. Because, of course, ERA 5 is a model-based product, which, well, it's assimilated observation data also go into, but not generally precipitation. So while we think most parameters are very good, the total amount of rainfall still has some biases around the world, especially in areas where few observations are being fed into this into the model that produces ERA 5. So the only variable that is corrected here is the precipitation. None of the other variables is bias corrected.
Okay, but there is a kind of bias of correction of bias when you go to the higher resolution of 1/10 of a degree, which also implies a bit of implicitly, at least, a bit of correction in local temperature biases, just because you have a better description of the land topography. I guess.
Yeah, that of course that the basis for the ERA 5 is the ERA 5 land, which is already a higher resolution than the normal ERA 5. So that solves already a number of, let's say, local biases that you may have if you're looking really at a specific station, for example. And but still, as I said, the precipitation, let's say the monthly totals are bias corrected against long-term recent decades of average precipitation for these months. But the spatial patterns and the temporal distribution over the day and over that is not bias corrected. It's only the total amount where we know that such biases are significant.
Okay, and the agriculture indicators that will be provided through the climate data store, these are all based on AG ERA 5, right? So it's high resolution, bias corrected.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
There's a question from Massimiliano. Please,
what about
Massimiliano,
near real-time delay expected for ERA 5? There is I don't know if it's already online, but I think so. The ERA 5 also has a very recent product nowadays, the ERA 5T it is called, so the temporary. And that means that with only a few days of delay, ERA 5 will be published on the C3S, on the CDS. And we will also do the further processing, this bias correction and this downscaling, etc., for the AG ERA 5 and aggregation for the AG ERA 5 product with the same delay. So maybe 1 day later, then also the AG ERA 5 should be available. And why do we say temporary? Because in this near real-time product of ERA 5, not always all possible observations have been assimilated into the model, and especially the observations have not yet been, let's say, thoroughly quality checked. So that's why ERA 5 does a reprocessing of the last 3 months, so that's to a final product, but then, as I said, with almost a 3 months delay. So also AG ERA 5, the last 3 months will be reprocessed to a final product once that becomes available. So that's the difference between this near real time and let's say the permanent product of ERA 5, but also of AG ERA 5.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. There's another really interesting question from Michael. Thank you, Michael, which is about very important topic for MedGold, which is the upscaling of climate services. And so maybe, Michael, if you're there, now you're there, maybe you want to ask the question directly. Can you, are you able to speak, Michael? Otherwise, I can do it for you.
Yes, sorry. Yes,
yeah.
Sorry, I was struggling to unmute the microphone. Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead, Michael.
Is an interest, you know, in the Met Office as well, where we develop services, and especially for MedGold too. So we are wondering, when you might develop a prototype service with just a small number of users, but then you might expand that to, say, a larger number of users in the same country or even globally, as you discussed. And all those people may have different might want different things, especially if you started bringing in, say, you type these commodity people who are interested in larger scale commodities rather than just farmers or agronomists. And also in other areas, there may be, I don't know, differences in local climate that might mean the service may have less, or the models you're using may have less skill in some areas compared to others. So I was wondering if you could say anything about how you have, say, expanded these climate services to greater number of users, and the sort of barriers you found and how you overcame those barriers.
Well, I think there are two parts to this answer. One is related to, let's say, the design of the service. What kind of parameters is important, and what other service characteristics, like I said, timeliness or continuity or these kind of things. And in that sense, we did not only build on the, let's say, the three users that we used in this latest product, but there were a number of projects already before. Of course, the experiences of which we also took into these developments. So I think the final collection of data sets and the specifications that we have right now are based on a larger sample than I showed in this particular presentation. On the other hand, of course, in trying to deal with all very specific requests or let's say contextualizations in different areas and different crops in different uses. Of course, that's not something that we can address as a service provider directly, and there we very often take the model that we're trying to stimulate, and that also I think the European Commission tries to stimulate, is that all kinds of companies, let's say consultancy companies or data brokers, they make this last mile to the specifications of individual users around the world. So we hope that this data will be picked up by kind of intermediaries who do this translation to the wide variety of potential users that we may have around the world. And we only try to provide a basic data service on which this can be built, a data service that is stable, that is quality assessed, that is up to date, etc. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ronald. So there's a big role to play from smaller companies and other actors to actually scale up the prototype services.
Yeah. For example, this is the last slide that I showed on the work that we did for the Heineken company. Yeah. That was together with a small consultancy company, specifically on the climate adaptation services, they call themselves. Yeah. And that's exactly, they use this kind of data and translate it much better to the user's need than we can do as Copernicus.
And this is also what we are trying to do in MedGold, and therefore this brings us directly to the second contribution of this morning from Alessandro, which will just tell us a bit about the work that we are doing in MedGold to develop the prototype services for our three sectors. So before leaving the floor to Alessandro, I just would like to ask if Ronald is available to stay with us for a few more minutes this morning. Just
yes, I will stay until the end of the session.
Okay, thank you very much, Ronald. So this is, if you have more questions, like Luigi, for example. Luigi has a question. Please, no, Luigi, go ahead now, and then we leave for Alessandro. But I also wanted to say that, if you have during this session this morning other questions for Ronald, of course, this is an opportunity to get a feedback for him. Just write in the chat, and we will see if we can reserve some more time for discussion. So, but now we have Luigi, please.
Thanks, Sandro. Just a quick question for Ronald, because I enjoyed his presentation very much, very detailed and very relevant to what I currently do, because they not only use indicators, but the indicators are also based on running crop models, which is very important, and you see it reflected in the data set Ag-IRA 5.
It seems we have lost.
Willing to assess what happens in terms
Luigi,
of the biology.
We have lost you for a few seconds.
Yeah, it's the thing tells me to turn off the video. Is it getting better?
It's getting better, yes.
Okay, so given that there's a lot that you can do with weather from the recent past, like Ag-IRA 5, I was wondering what was, Ronald, what was your experience with seasonal forecast, which I started to explore recently in terms of how to use them to run crop models and to assess the biology in the field from a climate service perspective.
Okay. The data set that we had produced, these agrometeorological indicators, the growing degree days, that is one that we also aim to be able to process on demand, let's say within the Copernicus system, but then also for seasonal forecasts. So when that comes available later this year, we still have a contract that is going to do that. That should also help you to more easily perhaps use the seasonal forecasts or to interpret them in terms of crop relevant indicators. Beside from what I do within this Copernicus survey, we also have been using seasonal forecast to directly feed into crop models. They're using the same WOFOS model that's developed in our group, for example. We looked at producing crop forecasts for Eastern Africa. And there also it showed that there's still, well, there can be quite some skill in forecasting crop yields. Well, basically even before crops are being sown, before the relevant growing seasons start in these areas. And of course that, well, it's still a little bit in its infancy, but really believe there's potential in the use of that. Of course, once you know what is coming up in terms of the coming growing season, and you have the sufficient lead time in doing that, you might still be able to adapt in, for example, choosing a different variety, choosing a fast maturing variety instead of a slowly maturing variety, or a more drought resistant variety in case a dry season is being predicted. So while I think let's say that the scientific technical potential for these kind of things is really there, in many areas of the world. In the beginning, we mentioned coffee. I think that's also a typical example there, because coffee is often grown in areas where we have considerable skill in predicting the coming season. Bringing this to the market, bringing this to the end users is still a different question, because seasonal forecasts are not easy to interpret. So I think we really, as service provider, have to help people more in going this last mile in implementing seasonal forecasts in crop models or whatever tools the users use to make an assessment of what they may expect in terms of yield for their specific crops. So yes,
Thanks,
the potential is
Ronald.
definitely there, but there's still some work to do to make this relevant for the end users.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Ronald. So I think we will have more. Yes.
Just one clarification. Could I ask a very quick question to Ronald before starting the presentation?
Well, of course, you can ask the question and then directly, go into your examples from MedGold.
Thank you again, Ronald, for your presentation. I have just a very quick question, because I understood at the beginning that Ag Era 5 should just reach the 2018. But now there is some updates, and now we should be something continuously updated for Ag Era 5. I'm right? I'm
yes,
correctly understood?
I hope somewhere after summer we will have a version of Ag Era 5 that's continuously updated. So with only a few days delay. I think it's the aim is about 5 days delay.
Great, with Ag Era 5. So great. So starting from
Era
the
5,
real
Ag
time
Era
of
5,
Era 5.
the whole data sets. Yes, that's the
Great.
idea.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a time horizon for this product?
Somewhere this autumn. Somewhere this autumn.
Thank you.
We currently implemented all the data that are there now have been pre-processed by us, but the near real time will be processed by once we installed our software on the ECMWF premises, and so then it will be run in the operational system and be updated every day with a few days delay.
Great. Thank you very much, Ronald.
Alessandro, since there's a question for Ron, again, another question from one of the attendees, I would like to go for it because it's a very useful one. It's a question from Balakrishnan. Do you assess the connection between the specific crop yield and estimated indicators? So what is your experience I guess, in the correspondence between climate indicators and then actually the crop yield, which is then, of course, the main parameter of interest?
Yeah, I think we've proved that there are a couple of very strong correlations between a number of these indicators and variations in crop yield. One of the most powerful is really these temperature sums, these growing degree days, these biologically effective degree days. Because let's say the time it takes for a crop to go from flowering to maturity, to when the seeds are ripe for harvesting, is very much temperature dependent. And of course, temperature can be measured very well, can be analyzed very well. It's also the best parameter predicted by seasonal forecast. And a considerable part of the variation in crop yield is really temperature dependent. And of course, there are other things like the water availability and all these kind of things. But temperature is a strong indicator for these kind of things. And that's not in this service, but one of my PhDs is currently working on a paper or revising a paper. We show for Eastern Africa, for example, correlations, yield correlation between observed yield from country statistics, with growing degree days, but also with things like season precipitation and even the evenness of the distribution of precipitation. So that's a simple indicators which still are quite powerful in this case in forecasting crop yield in that part of the world. So yes, simple indicators can be can be in some areas have a strong correlation with the yields.
With the yield, with the production itself.
Yeah, with the production itself, yes.
Okay, thanks. That was a nice, useful input. So please, Alessandro, tell us a bit about the work, the ongoing work in MedGold.
Thanks a lot, Sandro. Yes, now I would like to very briefly present an example of how we develop some kind of pilot climate service in MedGold, and I would like to present the example of the wine service. We can start from some slide presented by or prepared by Marta Bruno Suarez from the previous session. So the idea, the overall idea of co-design and co-development that we are adopting in MedGold, because each pilot service are co-produced with the specific users and with the technical team, and it is focused on specific problem of the industrial problem holder, but we are adopting a common methodological approach across the three service, and this is the methodological framework that you already know very well: assessing user need, developing the service, testing the service, and assessing the value of the service. So this is the very smart and inspirational slide from Marta. It is not a very smooth and linear process, but it includes a lot of interaction and adjustment and tuning of the service and so on. It is not so linear, but it is something more complex. And in particular, the very important point is that we have always to get feedback from the users in order to understand if the service that we are developing can work appropriately, and if we can change something in order to better assess the problem presented by the industrial partner. So if this is the overall landscape of the methodological framework that we are adopting, now we can move to a specific example. For example, here we report something about the wine service that we are developing in MedGold, as I already said. We have had a couple of focus group meeting with the Sogurape colleagues in Porto, one in the May 2018 and one last year in May 2019, just to better understand what's their real needs and what they ask to a pilot service, a prototype of service for their activity. We understand that the focus region for this problem is the Douro region that you can here see in this small map, and we get insight into the temporary resolution that they need, so in terms of seasonal prediction and climate projection as well. Sorry. And even the required level of reliability that at the beginning the users put as a threshold for using the service or not. And we can come back on this number later in case. And moreover, we also understood in this focus group the key decision in that they want to address in this kind of service, in particular in the time scale tackled from by Met Gold, in particular the idea of seasonal, and the key decision and the key aspect of their activities is about the pressure of pest for grapes, and even something about the harvest date and the duration of the harvesting period for at seasonal time scale, while for the climate projection, the main decision that could be influenced by climate information could be the siting, the choice of a new variety and rootstock, and even something about the future future wine style that they can obtain in their vineyard. And translating into some variables of interest, we have here a very simple summary of the essential climate variables that could be useful for them, and even some bioclimatic indicator like spring precipitation, the precipitation during the harvest period, the growing season temperature, and so on. So starting from these needs of the users, we understood that we have to select a list of a number of bioclimatic indicator, and in particular for this prototype we have been focused on 5 bioclimatic indicators, as I said: the spring precipitation, the growing season temperature, the number of summer days, so the day with daily temperature above 35 degrees, and also the harvest precipitation and the warm spell indicator. So the number of days, the number of events where the days are above the 19th percentile of the distribution. And so, and the other point that we understood during the code development and the co-design of the service is that we should start from a collection of good and bad years in order to understand if the service that we are developing could correctly reproduce and depict these good and bad years in the past. So starting from the experience and the memory of Sogrape, we have identified 5 case years, in particular for the bad years for the wine sector of the Douro region was 1988, 1993, 2002. And while for in terms of good years, they identified a couple of years, 2007 and 2011. And here in this color bar, we report the ranking of the bioclimatic indicator that selected in terms of percentile. So for example, if you look at the color bar of the spring precipitation, you can see that 1988 and 1993 exhibit a very high spring precipitation above the 80 percentile, and while the other bad years, on the other hand, show a very low spring precipitation. In terms of in terms of growing season temperature, for instance, we can see that all the bad years exhibit very, very low growing season temperature, while the good years show value of the growing season temperature above the normal. But in general, it's hard to say if a specific year was bad or good, starting only from one single bioclimatic indicator, because if we correctly understand the goodness or badness of an year depend critically on the concomitants of several factors that could affect the season. And so with the strong support and with the actual idea of co-design and co-development of the service, together with Sogrape, we build up a sort of compound risk index. And specifically in this slide, we present a compound risk index for the sanitary risk over the Douro Valley. So a sort of index that can measure the possibility to have high pest infestation, and so that a high number of sanitary treatment could be required for that season. And for the for this compound sanitary risk index, we have identified different sorts of risk for infestation, in particular the high or low spring precipitation. But if we have high spring precipitation, the risk could be higher and higher. Also, the high harvest precipitation could be another relevant factor for this index, and also the low growing season temperature. And so we have a tuning with the with Sogrape, with Antonio, and with the other colleagues in Sogrape, this index, tuning the right coefficient to weight in the right way all these factors. And here in this color bar, we report the representation of the sanitary risk index for the case years selected. And this ranking well fit with the memory of the colleagues in Sogrape. So the highest risk reported is for 1993. I don't know if you can see now the red arrow. It is the highest percentile, and while the 1988 also exhibit very high level of risk, and the 2002 is in terms of this source of risk quite close to the good years 2007, but if I correctly understood, it's what he actually went in the past. The 2 years were very, very close, but one was catastrophic and the other one was very good. So this ranking well fit the memory of the users. And another compound index that we have developed is about the heat risk, so about the heat stress that the grapes can affect during the growing season. And here the source of heat risk identified was the high worst palm duration index, high number of summer days, and high growing season temperature. Then the idea is to understand how the seasonal forecast, for instance, can reproduce this index, this compound index for the wine sector. And as you can see in the next presentation by Massi, the seasonal forecast show a probability of obtaining a value above the normal, below the normal, or value in line with the normal values of some essential climate variable. And even for the compound risk index, we report the result of the risk index in terms of tercile. So here in the green, we show the lower tercile, so the risk should be below normal, so relatively good years, while the yellow square is about normal risk, and the high risk is in red color. Here we have used a sort of traffic light color bar that could be more user-friendly and could be more immediate for the user. For instance, in this case, for year 2000, we have a good result, because the seasonal forecast for the year 2000 foreseen for the Douro region sanitary risk index below the normal, so the lower tercile, and the observation falls in the lower risk, the star that we are reporting over there, for a specific grid point in the Douro Valley. And so this is the main idea of the service that we are developing, but now we are in the phase of delivering the tool, and to can use this information, we have delivered a dashboard, a first release of a dashboard of MedGold, where the user can select or the historical climate, or the seasonal forecast, or even the longer time scale, so considering the climate projection, and obtaining information by themselves, possibly and hopefully user-friendly, and we are working on that, and they can also export the data in the format that they request since the beginning. This is an example of what they can obtain considering the sanitary risk by using a very high-resolution data set over the Portugal, up to 1 kilometer, PTIHRS. And this is the information that they can obtain so far in the present version of the dashboard for the seasonal forecast, with a resolution of 100 kilometers. This is the native resolution of seasonal forecast that we are using. We are using here the System 5 from ACMWF. And finally, an example of the climate projection. In this case, the bioclimatic indicator, summer days, and we are showing here the period 2031 up to 2060 with respect to the present climate, and then here they could have information about the possible future scenario for this climate information. And for sure, the work is not ended, but now we have had a number of meetings to present this service, and in particular the dashboard, to the users in order to obtain feedback to further improve the usability and possible utilization of this kind of service for the users, accordingly to the methodological framework that we are adopted. And more or less, that's it from my side.
Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you very much. I think this is a real-world experience on which describes what we are actually working on in this project, MedGold. Maybe next contribution will be from Massimiliano Pasqui from CNR. and it will be about the access and use of climate data. Before getting into that, we are still receiving questions, especially for Ronald, and we have one again on bias correction of AG ERA 5. And there was a question from Rahed. Do you want to ask your question directly, Rahed? So
Yes. I mean, I'm just referring to a small confusion because there is a version, at least, of the AG ERA 5 already available on the CDS. I don't know if this is what you've been referring to, Ronald, or if the data you've been talking about will become available and is not yet available. But what is available now, reading into the documentation, I see that precipitation is not bias corrected. So I'm a bit confused towards what is this data in specific. Yeah, that's my question.
Can you hear me?
yes.
I'm unmuted, just to check if I'm unmuted. No, I can easily understand your confusion because there are now a couple of products online in the CDS. So we have ERA 5, which is just plain ERA 5, no bias correction. We have ERA 5 Land, which is already higher resolution, which has the rainfall correction that I talked about. So the ERA 5 Land has the rainfall correction. The present ERA 5 does not have this last one, but the upcoming operational product will also be based on ERA 5 Land. So then we have both the rainfall correction as well as the specifics that we have now for this AG ERA 5 products. So you're completely right. At the moment, AG ERA 5 doesn't have the bias correction for rain, but the ERA 5 Land.
We have lost your voice, Ronald, for a second.
Muted?
Is it muted?
No?
Oh, yes, it was muted. It was probably muted, yeah. But now we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, just to restate then, the confusion is understandable because we now have these many products. So ERA 5 itself, of course, is just a simulation product, analysis product without any bias correction. The ERA 5 Land does have this bias correction for rainfall. So at least the rainfall climatology is correct. The AG ERA 5, not yet. Does they have this rainfall correction, because in the future it will be based on ERA 5 Land, and then it will have all these things as well. So thanks for pointing out, you were correct. But it will be more harmonized in the future.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move to the third contribution for today's session. We have Massimiliano Pasqui from CNR, Italy.
May I have just one question regarding the previous one? I thought it a very interesting presentation, this prototype service. Because what I did not understand yet from the presentation is how do you deal with, let's say, communicating the certainty and the skill of your prediction. You do give coming season will be above normal risk or below normal risk. But in one of your earlier slides, you said the reliability should be something like 70%, something like that. It was indicated as a kind of need by the user. So how do you communicate that for the, let's say, the coming forecast?
Yes, if I could very briefly come back. Thank you, Ronald, for this question, because it's quite appropriate. And for instance, in this, let me share now just a moment the screen. And for instance, in this kind of figure here, you can have the somehow the assessment of the in this case for the sanitary risk, but we have also produced the same kind of time series for all the bioclimatic indicator, because this is the time series of observation and seasonal forecast for the Hutjes period for 1993 up to present. In terms of the tercile for the seasonal forecast and percentile for the seasonal forecast, and looking at a single grid point. In this case, the users can have an idea on how many times the seasonal forecast have the can provide the right forecast for that season. Every time the star over there is inside the bar, inside the square, they could have a good forecast for this sanitary risk index. And and in addition to this, I would say heat rate, because this is a sort of heat rate. In the dashboard, there will be also the mask about the skill of the seasonal forecast for each variable and for each index in terms of the most common index like RPSS and so on, and so they could mask and in the dashboard the point where the seasonal forecast has no a clear added value with respect to the climatology. Say that it is one of the key point to be addressed, because as you say, the request of users in terms of reliability and is very high, and it probably is not aligned with the real forecast for that part of the world. And so this is one open point for the testing phase of the tool, because we have to strongly communicate the information about the skill and the heat rate of the seasonal forecast, for sure. So this is clearly an open question, and that fortunately we have another 1 year to work on that, and we have to take advantage of this time to correctly reply to this.
Alessandro, Emanuele is asking, in this figure, you have dots indicating the observations, in the historical observation, yeah. Then the color bars indicating the probability of being above, below, or in the norm during each year. So why are there years in which you don't have a bar?
Because for that, good question, thank you, Emanuele. Because for that years from the seasonal forecast available, it's not possible to identify the most likely tercile, because as maybe Massimiliano could better explain in the next presentation, the information is based on an ensemble of the forecast. In this case, we have used System 5, and we use a 25 member of forecast, and you have to count the simulation, the forecast where the value is above the normal, where is below the normal, and where is in the normal. And if you have two tercile with the same number of members, or in the case where no tercile has a so higher number of population with respect to the other one, we cannot provide a reliable information on that. So in case of some tercile with the same number of population, or when no tercile is above the 40% of the available forecast.
Thank you, Alessandro. I know we are taking, a lot of time with respect to the schedule that we have prepared for this session this morning, but we are getting a lot of very interesting questions, and I think it is, it is really important and interesting to try address all these questions, because it gives us the opportunity to have a bit more insight. And there's another interesting one from Rahel, who is asking to Alessandro, and maybe this brings to call also Antonio, how you have selected for the relevant indicators, how these indicators were selected, why we have selected those instead of others. And it might be obvious in some cases, but when we are developing a service, just as we're doing in the coffee sector, like identifying an indicator an appropriate indicator is the first strategic step. And so what has happened here in this case?
I don't know if Antonio would reply. I could add for sure something, but I don't know if Antonio would.
Well, I would start, Alessandro, from your perspective, and then also maybe Antonio. Very useful. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Since the first workshop, we have presented a higher number of possible bioclimatic indicator that could be of possible interest for the sector. During the workshop and during the internal interaction in Sogrape, we understood that these 5 bioclimatic indicators are the most relevant for them, and also, most importantly, something that they are already using and adopting for monitoring the situation over the region, and something that could be also already well known from them, and they can also, in this case, better extrapolate for the future. So I understood that this is the main reason why we focusing on that bioclimatic indicator. At the beginning, we have had a very slight difference, because at the beginning we didn't include the harvest precipitation, but the growing degrees days. But since the first interaction, we understood that the GDD is quite close to the growing season temperature bioclimatic indicators in terms of behavior, and so we substitute the growing degrees days with the harvest precipitation, because could be more important for the decision about the sanitary treatment and the harvest duration and so on. That's from my perspective and my point, my member on this.
Yes, I can just.
Yeah. Please, Antonio.
Yes, I can just complement that with the fact that in the wine business for some time now, indicators like the growing season average temperature, which correlates very highly with the Hugh index or the growing degree days index, have become quite used as a way to understand which varieties work best in specific sites, for instance, and also to have an overall assessment of the areas where you can grow grapes to produce high quality wines. So GST is today well known and well used, at least at the technician level, because we always have to separate here the different levels of users. And when I am talking about these indicators being widely used, I mean at both the wine science and the wine technical user types. If you go down to the level of the farmer, you don't have this as widely used, even though some of the more educated farmers already use also these type of indicators. On top of that, because we have a network of weather stations in place in our vineyards for more than 10 years now, we have assessed in studies and even in trials that were then the object of a peer-reviewed publications, which were those indicators that better correlated with crop indicators like production and quality of grape. And that was our first base to decide which would be the indicators we would use to for Met Gold. And then, as Alessandro was saying, when we started applying the use of those indicators to the memory users had in terms of better years and worse years, we realized that we were having some trouble in separating some years from others where we knew that we had very different outcomes. And that's when we decided to let go of GDD, because GST was already reporting that information at a very high correlation. And we brought in a harvest rain, which is the sum of rainfall between August 21st and October 21st, which has, especially on the years where we have a high incidence of rain during that time when we are ripening and harvesting grapes, it has a very bad impact, especially on quality, but as in some extremely rainy years on that moment, also in terms of quantity. And therefore, by bringing that in, we were able to separate in the risk indices. We were able to separate at a much better way the bad years from the good years.
Yeah. Using the existing consolidated experience in the different sectors is always most often the starting point for development in this respect. We are still getting questions, of course, and comments for interaction, but now it's time for Massimiliano to step in with his contribution on the use of climate data. And after the presentation from Massimiliano, we will stop for a few minutes and then get back with the team meetings that can be, also flexibly organized within each team. So please, Massimiliano, go ahead. I'm sure that you will also get a lot of questions.
Okay. I hope that my screen is now shared on your, and I try to be faster as possible. This presentation, this lot is essentially a guided tour on a range of a list of a potential source of information regarding regarding what is needed to build up a climate service. Let me start from a very effective piece of thinking regarding the fact that since the beginning, life has relied upon the transmission of messages. And the expectation of this exchange and this transmission, the expectation is that people hearing and seeing these warnings would realize the significant and take appropriate action. So this is a very technical documentation on a network protocol, so something which is very, very technical, but I like this comment, this words, since highlighted the effective of transmitting information. That the information you want to transmit should be effective in taking the appropriate action. Okay, you know that the conceptual framework of perceiving and adapting processes is a series of phases coming from the learning, something new, for example, through the understanding phase of what you have learned, but also you have to practice what you have understood in order to be able in transforming your activities and being effective in this roadmap towards something which is really new. And these phases are, of course, embedded in a science-based knowledge, but also is enriched by local and also non-technical personal experience that are able to modulate and also to enrich the process of transforming. Here, some questions arise very quickly regarding the
Massimiliano,
yes,
are you actually showing your slides? Because I think that we are seeing only your main screen.
I choose to share my window. Is not? Okay. I'll try to.
No, I think it would be better to show the entire screen and then it captures the presentation. Otherwise, we see your PowerPoint.
Okay. Now it should work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry for that. The burning question that now is quite evident is, for example, are we as scientists really addressing user needs on climate information? And what about the information chain between the data purveyors or providers and end users? And is the information trustable and usable enough? These are basic questions that we have been in our mind when we are trying to look and for new information for our climate service. The problem is quite complex since, for example, in the seasonal forecast framework, we are dealing with a complex source of data and information, of course. For example, the complexity introduced by the usage of an ensemble of members, equal probabilistic trajectories of potential realization of the future, it is something that needs to be faced with a very carefully, since we have many different equiprobabilistic trajectories, realization of the future, and we have to dealing with such a huge amount of information. in general, the choice, the final choice, is to compute the same information, the same analysis on each trajectory, and then count in order to build a probabilistic framework of description of the future scenario in order to deal with uncertainty, which is interrelated both to the physical dynamics and to the description of models, and finally to the uncertainty due to the starting point of our realization. In general, there are some more complex aspects, for example, a changing climatology, something which is not steady on longer time scales. Let's think about the future projection, for example, but we have to think about that just to build the right description of the uncertainty which is related to the computed information. Now, the typical decision support pathway is or could be simplified in a 3 steps process. In the first step, we actually put all the known knowledge, what we know about that specific process, for example, using past observations. Then we need something which is able to describe the real-time status. In other words, where we are now in the moment, in the specific moment in which we have to take some decision. And then we have to decide and to evaluate future scenario that could be available for us. That's because when we are dealing with the real-time status, we have to decide if we are in safe condition, and then we can use a business as usual approach, or in unsafe conditions, which require a specific action. In a very synthetic way, we can think about a climate service as something which is the result of linking knowledge to the action by bridging information through boundaries of monitored and modeled systems. This is a key point for an effective climate service. But in this process, we have to remind the fact that there are some critical issues. For example, in the transition phase from what we know to where we are, it could be possible to have an unsmoothed transition, for example, using different data sets that are for the past and then for the real-time evaluation. Or we can have a problem, we could have a problem on dealing with near real-time information. Or in the forward transition between the real-time status to the future scenario, we can have again some unsmoothed transition. For example, dealing with future scenario indicators which are not bias corrected with respect to past observations, or something which is which reveals a low level of conceptual coherence, indicators in the past or in the future that could not be linked directly and smoothly with those in the past. So there are some very important critical issues that often make the tools that we have only partially useful or uncomfortable in this kind of analysis. So we have to identify these critical points and make all the transitions in an effective way to guarantee an effective service. Okay, now let me go through a limited series of potential sources of information. I divided this list in essentially in two groups. The first group is something which is related to the amount of information which is came from something which is already based and analyzed by technical people and translated also into words or into graphs to be easily understood. For example, the Medcoff is one of these examples in which you can find something which is built after a consensus process. Here, for example, you have the last summer temperature outlook expected for summer 2020, where all the information, all the technical information are translated into something which is easily understandable. But of course, these kinds of products, even if it's described in words, could be not so effective or partially effective for a more specific need. For example, knowing something, the needs of knowing something which is directly linked to a specific crop, for example. Another example of that is another climate outlook forum, which are a series of forums managed by the World Meteorological Organization. Here you have a more specific and detailed analysis for a specific geographical area, in this case the eastern part of Europe, with a specific analysis. So in this case, something which is much more local than the previous one, which was an information that covers the entire Mediterranean basin. Another very important example is the CHIFEN, which is a specific forum for the Pacific Ocean. It is very, very effective for the southern parts of America, South America. And then we can go to another kind of source of information, what I define hybrid portals, in which you have a larger amount of information related to repositories with maps, data, and tools, but something which is not analyzed and translated by technicians or specific or scientists for end user or for a general end users. Let me start with the first one, the portal, the data library portal from IRI, the International Research Institute managed by Columbia University, with not only the seasonal forecast data, but also a very rich repository of near real-time data sets and the possibility to deal with these data using an effective interface that are able to allow you to build your own index and over your specific geographical area. So there is something which is really effective in terms of manipulating data for your own effective needs. And then probably the most aspiring place here in Europe, but with a worldwide coverage. The Climate Change Service, managed by the Copernicus program. This is becoming a very effective place where to find not only climatic data but also a large amount of data coming from other experiences, for example, other kinds of information which are collateral with the climate information data set, and a very useful framework for manipulate data, which is the CDS toolbox, the Climate Data Store toolbox, which using the Python language, through the Python language, you are able to compute what you really need, and avoiding to download on your personal workstation all you need, and delivering the computational part on the server side. This portal is, of course, enriched by also quite useful maps covering the entire world, and the number of datasets available is increasing rapidly since last year, and it will be a process that will continue also in the future, of course. Let me show you briefly some more example on that. There is the so-called long-range forecast multimodal ensemble managed by the WMO Lead Center. Here, another experience on the possibility to merge different sources of seasonal forecast systems to provide information based on maps and also on the part of indexes ready to be used by users. There are some very, very interesting examples also from the Africa continent. For example, one of my favorite is the ICPAC portal with many, many information regarding not only the climate sector, but also information on crops and also on ongoing problems. For example, probably you know that we are now for the eastern parts of Africa during one of the most effective desert locust upsurge, which are a very prominent problem in that area, and probably in the next months over a wider region in Africa. Here in this bulletin, there are different information together in a very effective way in which you have the possibility to see problems on crops, but also on zones which are affected by locusts in this case. Let me highlight also our drought observatory portal developed with a team of colleagues of mine, covering many aspects related on the drought management, not only from a climatic point of view, but with a large number of indicators coming from satellite estimates on the status of the vegetation, and the possibility to merge this information together and to manipulate data in order to have specific information, the specific information required. Another really interesting place for information is from the ACMAD, the African Center for Meteorological Application for Development, which covers the wide region of Sahel with a focus on the western parts of Africa. Here, a large number of specific information on weather and the systems, the climatic mechanisms that are acting on this part of the globe. Finally, the dashboards designed and built in the framework of MedGold. Here, the capacity of the real-time interaction between developers and end users was one of the most effective driver of this platform development. In this case, you have typical information, but also specific indicators based on the specific knowledge coming from the end user side. And as I told you at the very beginning, this interaction could be very, very beneficial for the developing of a climate service. Finally, let me highlight a couple of online training resources that are free, available for everyone, which are rich of many detailed information on the use of seasonal forecast and on the source of information available. That some of them I showed you in the previous slides. The first is the Climate Service Training Initiative from my institute, and the second is the user learning services that are managed by Copernicus, not only to provide a basic information on this sector, but also to provide a very effective support in terms of using the available and the new tools developed for the climate data store. Again, these services are for free and are very rich of interesting information and documentation. So at the end, let me highlight this very ancient phrase: if you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading, from Lao Tzu. Remembering that the transforming action, the transformation of your business as usual way of acting should be changed from the very beginning, from the ground, using the knowledge that we already possess. So thank you very much for your attention, and mind the gaps, especially for those that are uncomfortable. Thank you very much again for your attention.
Thank you, Massimiliano. Thank you very much. So we are not too late on schedule, but this morning we had a very interesting session with a lot of questions, and I think we do have time for a few questions. But meanwhile, I also would like to give a bit of indications for the work ahead today. So I would suggest that we can now, after the morning session, take a short break. And since what we have in the program today is parallel team meetings to discuss the ongoing development within each team, I will leave this afternoon free for all teams to self-organize in the best way they can think of to work together. And I just want to remind that we now are discussing in the main meeting room on our platform, but each team can use its own meeting room, its own meeting ID to organize parallel sessions. So probably after a short break, each team can decide how and when to have their dedicated meeting. Now, I don't know if there are more questions for Massimiliano, but also for Alessandro for the session before. Unfortunately, Ronald had to leave at some point, so is not with us. But I think Ronald will be happy to answer more questions even offline if you have some. One question I have for Massimiliano is about the drought monitoring tool he was showing. Does it have a specific focus, geographical area or focus? I think there was an highlight over Italy in the slide that you were showing, but does it have a general coverage? What are the indicators that underlie this monitoring tool? Can you comment a bit more on that?
Yes, sure. Thank you for your question. Actually, the drought monitoring coverage, the entire European continent, from the Scandinavian down to the northern parts of Africa. At the moment, we use this large but limited area just to be more effective in terms of real-time check and download the information from satellites. Since some of the indexes that we are providing are computed on a real-time basis using schedule processes, we now are operating over the whole Mediterranean basin and also the northern parts of Africa. Over that area, we are able to provide all the vegetation indexes, all the drought indexes in a quasi-real-time, near real-time mode.
Okay, thank you, Massimiliano. And since we're talking about developing climate services, so where does the demand for this service, for this tool, come from? Who was asking for this information, and how is it used, to your knowledge?
Well, actually, we started since we are being parts of the Italian National Civil Protection Technical Board on water management. That started in 2007 after the very intense winter drought we experienced between 2006 and 2007. After that, we start developing this kind of tools as an operational one. So this is part of real questions regarding the specific indicators. And then we are also using that for the action related to the forest fire campaign over Italy, but of course we enlarge the coverage area to cover the entire Europe for some specific international projects that are now active.
Okay, thank you, Massimiliano. Other questions from all participants? I mean, you can just step in and ask your questions. No need to write on the chat. Just if you have anything out of your curiosity, I mean, it can be related to Massimiliano, to Alessandro, or to whatever you have been hearing during these sessions. So it's an open space. We sometimes like to describe MedGold as a DSS, which is, however, instead of a decision support system, is a discussion support system. And this is what actually happens quite a lot in the project. So it's now 10 minutes past 1 p.m. So I think it's time now for a short break in case there's no other questions or comments from you. As said before, I would now, close the general session, the plenary session for today. So we do not reconvene here in the plenary room, but I would invite each team to organize their meetings. I already have a kind of a meeting for the schedule for our risk-off team on coffee. I don't know what happens with the other teams. Is there what's in the plan? Maybe Marta or Massimiliano, as mentors, coordinators, want to give us an indication?
I think my group is going to meet after this session, although we're not sure about some of the participants, so we're trying to figure this out now.
Okay.
The same from the green team. We are scheduled a meeting just after this plenary session, so after the comfort break.
Okay, so very good. In this case, I would also ask the risk-off team, just when we close here, to go on the other chat, and so I know we have someone that has to leave soon, so we decide how to do. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. I think today was quite interesting. A lot of discussion, a lot of useful information came out. So I hope that this will be also useful for your teamwork. So have a good rest of the day with the Living Lab in MedGold, and we will reconvene here in the plenary meeting room on next Thursday. Let me know if there is anything you want to add or comment before we close this session. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a good day, and let's talk next Thursday here, 11 a.m. Cheers.